Dear ladies and gentlemen, today the G20 Summit is coming to an end. This is the culmination of Brazil's presidency of the G20, which led it throughout the year, held a large number of events, as it usually happens. And I think that very positive results have been achieved, weighty agreements. This is very important. First of all, the new coordination structure of the Global Alliance to Fight Hunger and Poverty was supported. This is a personal initiative of President Lula. The goal of this initiative is to accelerate progress towards the complete eradication of hunger, as is required with the Sustainable Development Goals, which have long been approved, but are practically not being implemented. And it must be done before the 2030th year. I hope, and even with a certain degree of confidence, I can say that the creation of such an alliance will improve the indicators in this direction of the Sustainable Development Goal. Russia has joined this mechanism and has already reported that we are adding our best practices to the package of projects that will be implemented under its auspices, which are embodied in programs to help developing countries, in particular, school nutrition programs and the development of farms. They are designed to transfer appropriate technologies, experience, and methodology to developing countries that will allow them to rely on their own strength to a greater extent. We have confirmed our principled position that the Group of 20 is primarily an economic forum, and this is what it was created for, and its purpose was a substantive economic dialogue between developed, relatively speaking, and developing economies, in order to find optimal ways to develop the world economy in the interests of all, in the interests of overcoming poverty and inequality, and ensuring the most effective functioning of all multilateral institutions. And of course, the G20 should be based on the principles of the UN Charter, first of all, the principle of sovereign equality of states. This has never happened in Western politics. It has never respected sovereign equality, and now life is forcing. Given that the BRICS countries and other states that cooperate with the BRICS are growing at a much higher rate. And in any case, the UN is the basis of all international cooperation, in all fields. It is necessary to apply the principles of the Charter, not choosing how I change and how the West likes to do it, but in the entirety of these principles and in all their interconnectedness. The declaration was adopted. Of course, you have already read it. I will not retell it. The document is complex. And the main thing is that it recognizes modern realities and is subordinated, if so analyzed, to its main central task of building international relations based on multilateralism, pluralism, the elimination of all forms of inequality, both between states and within the state. Many have noted, including us, that inequality and the same tasks of eliminating hunger and poverty are increasingly related to developed countries, where the number of people living below the poverty line is increasing. But in principle, these forms of inequality, which are visible on the international arena, are the result of the colonial, neo-colonial practices of our Western colleagues and, in general, the result of the dominance of the West, which lasted for several centuries. The text, despite the fact that the majority insisted on preserving the declaration exclusively within the framework of the economic agenda, includes a section, a page that deals with the geopolitical situation, primarily from the point of view of various conflicts in different parts of the world. We agreed to this, just as we agreed to the same denouement in the declaration of last year's G20 Summit, which was held in New Delhi. The West, of course, tried to Ukrainize the entire agenda. It failed. No one from the countries of the world majority, the Global South, did not support it. Both we and our colleagues from the developing world insisted that the text be devoted to any conflicts. The need to resolve each and every conflict that currently persists on the globe, and above all the conflict in the Middle East. The tragic fate of the Palestinians is largely the result of the social engineering and direct interventions in the Middle East region that they practice Washington with the support of their allies.
Прямых вмешательств в регион Ближнего Востока, которые практикует Вашингтон при поддержке своих союзников.
There is also a paragraph on Ukraine with which we agreed, because the main thing in it is a call for an honest and reasonable conversation about peace on realistic grounds. I would like to note an important circumstance in connection with the fact that I spoke a little earlier about Eustafon. There is also a paragraph in this text with which this section actually begins, and which generically requires dealing with conflicts on a fair basis, looking for peaceful solutions based on international law, the UN Charter in its entirety. This is fundamentally important because if it is projected onto the Ukrainian situation, the West sees in the Charter only the principle of territorial integrity. He wants to return to Ukraine, dreams of all the territories up to the borders of 1991. The territories where Russian people lived for centuries, whose rights the Nazi Zelensky regime destroyed legislatively. And they do not want to pay attention to this, although in another part of the Charter, in the very first article, it is clearly stated about the need to respect human rights regardless of race, gender, language, and religion. The rights of Russians and Russian speakers in Ukraine, as far as language and religion are concerned, have been destroyed by law. But the West will still approve. No, 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 let it remain, because Zelensky defends European values, they say so. But give these territories to these people, and let him with they are further sorted out. A disgrace. The main issue, if we return to the economic agenda, apart from the fight against hunger and poverty and inequality, is the reform of global institutions. Most of the delegations of the Global South, noted the dominance of Western players in these structures, which, firstly, cannot claim their exclusivity for moral reasons, and secondly, cannot do so for reasons of modern realities. The world has changed dramatically over the past few decades. By and large, it has acquired a new face. The figures have been repeatedly quoted. The BRICS account for 37% of the world economy. The 7 have fallen below 30%. This gap continues to grow. Of course, at least because the growth rates of the BRICS countries, are on average 4% at the moment, and the average growth rates of the group of 7 countries are 2 times less. We remember how the summit was held in Kazan on October 22-24. It was mentioned in most of the speeches of the countries of the Global South and demonstrated, according to the assessments that were made here, that the BRICS had matured to the formation of an independent toolkit that would not depend on the West, meaning payment, settlement, clearing, investment, exchange, and other mechanisms. This work has been launched. It was mentioned today. No one wants to close down the institutions that operate in the post-war world order, both the Bretton Woods Institution and the World Trade Organization. But given the big problems associated with the fact that the West, which controls these institutions, abuses its positions, in parallel, the creation of tools, which I have said, makes direct sense. And the BRICS countries as a whole in the G20 are increasing their role, their influence. This was evident both in Delhi at last year's summit and at the year before last in Indonesia, and here it was especially clear. The strengthening of the position of the BRICS, of course, was facilitated by the fact that, by the decision of last year's summit. The African Union joined the G20 as a full member, and this time, the Brazilian presidency invited the president of the new development bank among the summit participants. Among other summit participants, this bank was created on the initiative of the BRICS and the leadership of the Arab League. And the declaration confirms that it is necessary to raise and strengthen the voice of the world majority countries in all leading political and economic bodies, from the Security Council to the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the reanimation of the full-fledged activities of the World Trade Organization on dispute settlement. The main body of the TOE is blocked and cannot perform its functions, because the Americans in fact he was taken hostage by procedural tricks. And in the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, for more than 1 year, the countries of the Global South, with the support of the Russian Federation, have been trying to increase their share in the distribution of quotas and votes in the IMF and the World Bank, in such a way that these shares reflect their real weight of the world economy. Once again, we wrote down this slogan in the declaration of the G20. All our previous attempts to adopt the relevant appeals ended in vain because the West, having subscribed to this fair thesis, in practical terms does everything to keep it on paper. In our speeches, I have spoken twice on the reform of global institutions and on food security issues. I have familiarized with the work of our country on the implementation of President Putin's initiative, on the formation of a large Eurasian partnership with the participation of the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other associations on our continent, which we consider potentially as a material basis for the formation of a new Eurasian security architecture, also open to all countries of the continent. It has shown our contribution to solving the problems of food and energy security, where, as confirmed by statistics, we are reliable and leading suppliers. This is not all that Russia can offer to the Global South, and in practice we are establishing very close cooperation with them in many other areas, complex, effective information and communication technology products that are more and more of Russian origin, which are of more and more interest to our partners in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. And in general, I would like to note the fact that the success of the Brazilian watch as a whole this year develops very positive results of the work of the G20 and previous summits in Indonesia in the 22nd year, and in India in the 1923rd year, and the next chairman will be the South African Republic. That is, such a BRICS watch will last for another a year has passed, and our South African colleagues have already announced their priorities. They intend to promote the agenda for the reform of global institutions, as I have just said, but also in general. Capacity building in the field of sustainable development with an emphasis on the same tasks of combating poverty, hunger, inequality, and for obvious reasons, South Africa will pay special attention to the problems of the countries of the African continent, and in our dialogue with Africa in the framework of the Partnership Forum, which was created by the decision of last year's Russian-African Summit in St. Petersburg. The forum was launched a couple of weeks ago in Sochi at the first ministerial meeting of the countries of the African continent. We will take into account the work of our friends in this area, and I think this will be a very working, informal, but useful coordination. These are our estimates. Sergey Viktorovich. Hello, Russia 24, Boris Ivanin. You have just started by saying that you support Brazil's initiative to create a global alliance to fight poverty and hunger. In a little more detail, if possible, how now Russia, Brazil including, as BRICS partners, intend to strengthen this contribution to ensuring global food security, and how, most importantly, is the West speculating on this topic? Well, the West speculates on this all the time. They have, in general, such a way of turning everything around in such a way that it turns out that someone else is necessarily to blame, and not Western countries. On food security, President Putin has repeatedly cited an example of such feverish, ill-conceived emissions during the pandemic, when the United States and the European Union together, in my opinion, printed about $10 trillion and euros, and began buying up everything on the market with this money, preparing for periods of isolation so that there was food and so on. That's when prices have already soared. For our part, we have always satisfied the request of developing countries, even now, when we are being hindered from using Western ports to export our fertilizers and grain, wheat and other grains, when insurance companies have raised rates to the skies, because Lloyd's has declared the entire territory and all ports of the Russian Federation a war zone. They just took it like that. And they wrote officially to everyone who cooperates with them, it automatically doubles, triples, and calculates insurance rates. And, of course, many other obstacles that Western countries have been fixing and are fixing have arrested our fertilizers, that is, they have closed normal, efficient, optimal ways for us to export our products, which the Global South needs. And they accused us of this, because that's how it happens, because the Russians started the war. It's clear to everyone, it's not serious, especially for people who seem to look like adults, but continue to promote these theses of their own no-redder, and this also surprises me very much. As I have already said, the very idea of the alliance is that 80-odd countries have signed this document, and Russia was one of the first to support this initiative. The point is that, bearing in mind the Sustainable Development Goals, in this particular case, the goal of eliminating hunger and poverty by the year 2030, so that all participants help, who can contribute to accelerating progress towards this task. As I have already said, we have a wealth of experience, many years, including through a bilateral line. We are developing a program to provide school meals primarily to our neighbors in Central Asia, but also in other parts of the world, both in Africa and in Latin America. We have projects to support farms, transfer modern technologies. We have farming in Russia developing rapidly, efficiently, as evidenced by the data on the harvest, which pleases us all every year and allows us to export a lot. And so every country, someone has experience in other areas, we can. For example, our Algerian friends told us when Algerian President Taiban came to Moscow on a visit. They really need fertilizers, he said, but I would prefer to buy from you, but in principle. Set up production in the country for us, and we will do it. Every country that has signed the Declaration on the Creation of the Alliance has the opportunity to contribute in some way, including through the World Food Programme, through the FAO of the United Nations Agricultural Organization, and through other structures. Their leaders attended the meeting dedicated to the creation of the alliance, and I think this is a very useful undertaking. And I am sure that the Brazilians, being the authors of this idea, of course, will not let it go, will not leave it to chance, and will constantly be engaged in its practical implementation. We will support them in this.
Конечно же, не оставят ее на самотек и будут постоянно заниматься ее практической реализацией, мы их будем в этом поддерживать.
Sergey Viktorovich, good afternoon. How was the coordination of the wording of the declaration on the situation in the Middle East going?
You know, of course, the West was reluctant to discuss this text, but it was well aware that there could be no section on conflicts without it.
Но прекрасно понимал, что без этого никакого раздела, касающегося конфликтов, быть не может.
There have been attempts by the West to have this paragraph, which is detailed, saturated with assessments that emphasize the tragic, catastrophic situation of the population and Gaza.
Катастрофическую ситуацию населения Газы.
There were attempts to put this paragraph after the Ukrainian one, but here, even we did not have to emphasize the rejection of such manipulation, juggling, because the countries of the Global South categorically refused to belittle the importance of the fact that the G20 should first of all pay attention to the tragedy of the Gaza Strip.
Того, что двадцатка должна прежде всего обратить внимание на трагедию сектора Газа. Там есть, как я сказал,
Before the Palestinian paragraph and the Ukrainian paragraph following it, there is such a general paragraph about how to act in all conflicts and what tasks should be set to resolve these conflicts. And there is clearly written categorical rejection of civilian casualties and categorical rejection of strikes on civilian infrastructure.
Жертв среди гражданских лиц и категорическое неприятие ударов по гражданской инфраструктуре.
This is a very interesting circumstance because the civilian casualties in 1 year of Israel's operation in Palestine, the Palestinian victims' children, the elderly, women, civilians.
Операция Израиля в Палестине, палестинских жертв, дети, старики, женщины, гражданские лица.
The number of these victims is about 45,000 people. This is almost 2 times more than the number of civilian victims on both sides of the conflict in Ukraine in the 10 years after the coup.
С обеих сторон конфликта на Украине за 10 лет после госпереворота.
A year and 10 years, almost twice as much. This alone, of course, shows what is happening in Palestine and how to resist it. And the second thing I mentioned in this general paragraph is that it is unacceptable to damage civilian infrastructure. In the Gaza Strip, dozens of hospitals, dozens of residential buildings are destroyed every day. All of this is posted on social networks and in general, and the West is still slowing down in the Security Council, slowing down the strict demand to stop violence. But the civil infrastructure is also interesting in the sense that it also includes the northern streams. I think this will help us in the practical work that we are continuing, first of all, to achieve a transparent investigation, which Germany alone is still continuing, but secondly, so that the international community can also look at it. Sergey Viktorovich, Dmitry Belkovich, BRICS TV. You have already partially mentioned the reform of global governance institutions. Please tell us, in your opinion, what are the interests of the countries that have converged? To what extent are these changes that were declared following the results of the first day of the summit relevant? How comprehensive are they? These results have already been concluded in the declaration. They are both relevant and comprehensive. And the reforms of global governance institutions will be mentioned by the Security Council in the political part. This is a well-known topic that requires consensus, if not full consensus, then broad general agreement in the UN, because by voting, the Charter allows voting, and if 2/3 of the votes are cast, then such a reform will be considered legitimate. But the trouble is that for the 1/3 that is not yet ready for certain models of reform, such a Security Council that will be voted on, it will be less legitimate. That's the problem. There are countries that categorically do not want new states to be added to the number of permanent members. And there are countries that require permanent members to be considered as a priority, new permanent members. We support India and Brazil, which have declared their desire to run for permanent members. But in order for this to be fair, it is absolutely necessary to take into account African interests in the same context and in the same quality. The West wants to slowly wind up this process, although it verbally declares that it is necessary to expand. The Americans have already stated that they support India, Germany, and Japan. And why Germany, Japan, when they will not bring any added value to the Security Council? They simply repeat in unison everything that Washington says. The West is already overrepresented. 6 members out of 15. These are Western countries. And when Japan is elected, 7 out of 15, it's too unfair. In the economic and financial sphere, I said, the International Monetary Fund, where the reform of quotas and votes has been stalled for years, and this, of course, shows the unwillingness of the United States to put up with economic realities, and shows their desire to slow down, at least, or even block the process of forming a multipolar world, in such a way that this world it did not depend on one hegemon, which has the IMF, the World Bank, the dollar, and the World Trade Organization in its hands. As I have already said, BRICS is in the process of creating its infrastructure, not against the Bretton Woods institutions and the TOE, but in parallel with it, and in the meantime, we will continue to seek fair reforms. In the World Trade Organization, the dispute settlement body has been blocked by the Americans for more than 1 year. They simply do not allow the necessary number of experts to be elected to this body so that there is a quorum, and it cannot work according to the rules that the TOE exists. They started blocking the work of this mechanism when they saw that China was overtaking on the very field of globalization that the Americans themselves created. According to the rules created by the Americans, the Chinese economy has proved that it is more efficient. And then tricks were used to block the work of the dispute settlement body, because China sent the relevant claims there. In accordance with the rules, then more and more aggressive protectionism began to be applied. Now Europe imposes exorbitant duties on the same Chinese products, electric cars, and the Americans will do the same. At the same time, such a person as Ursula von der Leyen publicly stated that we are doing this in order. Or rather, we are doing it because their electric cars are too cheap and our manufacturers will suffer. What is this? Is this a fair competition? The competition is to make cheaper things that are in demand. China is doing exactly that. But the bosses in the European Union do not think so. In principle, they don't think much about their consumers, including it was manifested in the way they solve food problems, accusing us of all mortal sins, that we are starving developing countries, while at the same time, Ukrainian grain, which is already produced by a third on the lands bought up by American corporations, is being bought for themselves. You know, there were probably protests by farmers not so long ago, because prices have fallen, that is, it's okay to buy cheap. And not always high-quality Ukrainian grain at low prices, it's okay, but cheap Chinese electric cars are impossible. In general, the European Union is going through a deep crisis, in my opinion, including such a conceptual one. When more and more capitals do not want to listen to Brussels, where bureaucrats are holed up, not elected by anyone, and concerned only with pursuing the policy that the United States needs in Europe. As a result, one of the results has become more expensive energy. Energy prices in Europe are 3 to 4 times higher than in the United States, This leads to industrialization. Business moves to America mainly. You know, there are a lot of facts there. Therefore, who would talk about energy and food security with an angry look at Russia, but not the European Union?
Гневным взором, обращенным на Россию, но только не Евросоюз.
Viktor Siniak, Izvestia Ms. Sergey Viktorovich, tell me please, at the summit, did you discuss with representatives of other states, Western or friendly to us, these notorious permission of the Americans to hit our territory with long-range missiles? If so, what opinions have you listened to and what do you think is why, despite the permission, despite the discussion that it exists? Not an American leader, not an American friend, the Secretary has not officially announced this permission yet. And I'm sorry, please, more messages just come very quickly. Here are the strikes inflicted on the Bryansk region by Eradicate missiles, 6 missiles. Their exact modification is still unknown. But what do you think it was connected with these discussions about it? I have a question. I'm sorry. How can I know if what he printed in the New York Times is true or an attempt to probe the ground? I don't know. The fact that the attacks tonight in the Bryansk region were used repeatedly. This is a signal that they want escalation. And it is impossible to use these high-tech missiles without the Americans, as Putin has repeatedly said. And he warned about how our position would change if the range they are talking about now, up to 300 kilometers, was approved. And in fact, this is disapproval for Ukraine to use long-range missiles, and this is just an announcement that we will now hit up to 300 kilometers. I just can't confirm, because everyone writes as if the matter has been resolved, even the barrel. The barrel said that it was already official, and the Europeans, they say, discussed it, but decided that everyone would make a decision for himself. Make a decision whether to allow their weapons to be used long-range by Ukrainians. I will not on this, the topic is guessing. Today, the basics of the nuclear doctrine have been officially published, everything has been confirmed there. And now it has been legislated that the President has been voicing publicly for a little over a month, and I hope that they will read this doctrine, not as they read the mouthpiece, seeing only what they need, but the doctrine in its entirety and interconnectedness. Someone asked me on the move on the sidelines, is it true? I said, I do not know if this is true or not true. We are engaged in ensuring our security. We have officially said everything that those who are thinking about it need to know. The President has said, and now we have already fixed it in an official document. The media is already discussing the fact that Macron ran up to you and shook your hand in the last photo. In your opinion, what kind of Western games are these on camera? Well, you know, in principle, there are people who know each other if there are deep contradictions between them, between the countries that these people represent, but somewhere these people encounter in a public place. But I think it's absolutely normal if they know each other to say hello to each other.
Но я считаю, это абсолютно нормально, если они знакомы, поздороваться друг с другом.
I think it's not normal when many European leaders shy away from Russian representatives when they see them in the corridors, on the sidelines, in the photo room.
Когда видят их вот там в коридорах, в кулуарах, на фотографировании.
Last year, I already gave this example. At the summit in India, we were waiting for the start of the event, and I went into the hall where the participants were already gathering, and there 2 African leaders were sitting at the same table with Michel. I knew these presidents personally. They saw me, we said hello, and I, as a polite person, turned around and extended my hand to Michel. He jumped up as if stung, turned away. Well, then it's just such an upbringing. That's the whole answer to this question. Sergei Viktorovich, Olaf Scholz repeated on G20 that Germany does not intend to supply Taurus to Ukraine, nor does it intend to allow it to strike deep into Russian territory. Given this, that Scholz refuses to follow in the footsteps of Biden, Starmer, Macron, taking into account also the fact of his conversation between Scholz and Putin, the dialogue initiated by the German Chancellor. Can we talk about a split in the Western camp? Well, we all see the same facts and analyze both as diplomats and as journalists, but if, as you very correctly recorded, Scholz has this position, he has repeatedly said that this position is principled. Despite the fact that the Greens, someone else is on him, Mercis the CDU is directing critical arrows at him. They still demand to hand out such permission, but I think this position is Scholz.
Критические стрелы требуют все-таки раздать такое разрешение. Но я считаю, вот данная позиция Шольца.
These are responsible positions. The fact that it differs from the position of both the British and the French are the same.
Британцев и французов, кстати, тех же самых.
This is also a fact.
Hello, Ekaterina Nolskaya, Rush News. In your opinion, don't you think that France's aggressive policy, especially now, in particular with the current events related to Russia, it distracts France itself from important, pressing issues? Her attention is distracted by important issues, such as the fight against hunger, food security, and the very potential of France is being undermined, which could just now solve these issues and not interfere with the world.
I remember that it is more convenient for the French government and French experts to talk about this topic. I can only quote Economy Minister Bruno Le Maire, in my opinion, a year ago, even a little more, in August last year. He sounded the alarm just on the topic that energy prices in Europe are 4 times higher than in the United States.
Бил тревогу как раз на тему того, что цены на энергоносители в Европе в 4 раза выше, чем в Соединенных Штатах.
Probably, this is exactly the characteristic of what price support for the Kiev regime has. Macron is indeed, both verbally and in practice, one of the most ardent supporters of the war before the victory over Russia, before the strategic defeat of Russia. Ukrainian servicemen are currently studying there in France, completing their training, and a whole brigade of such an assault strike is being prepared. They are directly involved in military operations, actions in fact. The same goes for the talk about using French Scalp missiles, which are, in general, identical to the British Storm Shadow. Yes, we have probably seen a lot of reports from Paris, where not everything is so blissful, even in Paris. Judging by the way the streets look, how people come out there with protests. Therefore, I repeat, it is not for us to decide. We cannot make decisions for them. They have a constitution, laws. They have accumulated experience of popular protests and much more. Ursula von der Leyen expressed great interest in energy prices. She said that American liquefied natural gas is cheaper than Russian. But when her experts laughed at her and began asking questions to her press secretary, he replied, "This is also a brilliant answer. She meant cheaper not economically, but politically."
Стали задавать вопросы ее пресс-секретарю, он ответил, это тоже блестящий ответ, она имела в виду дешевле не в экономическом плане, а в политическом.
In other words, she believes that buying Russian gas, it's politically expensive because you earn the wrong kind of political reputation for yourself. Well, how can this be considered normal logic? But they live somehow.
We have a few questions from media correspondents.
That is, you didn't understand anything until now, did you?
Formulate my question in English. I'm sorry, it's the only alternative I have right now.
Okay.
Can I?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Foreign Minister, I'd like to ask what is Russia's view on the Brazilian-Chinese initiative of trying to foster a group of countries to discuss a peace process in Ukraine. The group last met in New York in September.
A bit louder.
The group last met in September in New York, but ever since we've had an election in the United States, we are seeing an escalation in Ukraine with the decision of the U.S. to allow the use of long-range missiles to hit Russian territory. So under these circumstances, I'd like to ask what is Russia's views of this Brazilian-Chinese initiative? It still makes sense for both countries to pursue a initiative in this sense. Thank you.
Well, on the decision
United States long, the New York Times has grown the new confirm Ada White House, the Pentagon, and Day Physics.
Up to 300 kilometers long. We read what the New York Times published about this. There are still no confirmation either from the White House or from the Pentagon, but we basically take our position on the basis of what is going on physically.
Physics or attack of Notes Inkel and Bryansk, the region of Rush, Happy Eni modification attacks with Ken America Expert Inc. With light data, Inkel Pro.
Bryansk Oblast of Russia, which is bordering Ukraine, and we proceed from the understanding that this is happening, and that any modification of ATACMS cannot be used without American experts and instructors, including satellite data, including programming and targeting. The President mentioned this several
Times
times.
and Apple from Territories expert, military
Are
expert.
going to be applied from Ukraine into Russian territory, it will also mean that they are operated by American experts, military experts. And we will be taking this as a quality.
In the new phase spring, and gain Strasha Trump, position Ken Hespel, Politicula declineral Brazil, China practice activity friends. And rally.
Trump position on Ukraine, I cannot guess. He said that he is a president of peace, not the president of war. People, politicians in particular, who declare that they prefer peace to war, deserve support, I think, in general. It's like Brazil and China, they want peace. And this intention we can only welcome. As regards the practical activities of this group of friends, it met only once in September, and the meeting was about announcing about the creation of this group.
At the rallies, but Wember and New York and Tun Woodfall are active. You are an expert initiative Xi Jinping. Global Security Initiative, Generics Eni conflict.
Would follow these activities. We would expect this group to take into account the initiative of Chairman Xi Jinping of February 2023. It was global security initiative, not about Ukraine, not about Palestine, generic approach to any conflict. And one of the key rule which was formulated in that
Global Security Initiatives, and now the China conflict from the sponsor of the Brazilians, the FS Leader Group, and the niche, is the Global Security Root Conflict Initiative of Baikan and Brazil.
So I assume that since China is co-sponsor with Brazil of this group of friends, and since Chinese leader initiated this global security document, which insists on the need to remove the root causes of any conflict, that this would be applied to the Ukrainian initiative by China and Brazil. And the
Ruth,
root
a security, O Frasha, putting NITO infrastructure deposit.
Attempts to undermine security interests of Russia by pulling Ukraine into NATO and building NATO infrastructure just on our borders. And the second root cause, after the coup d'etat in 2014 in February, next morning after a deal was signed by the president, the then president and the opposition, they staged the coup. And
France-Poland guarantee, gentlemen, the Times itself democracy expert K. Party, past lost scrap hurried miles. And not exterminating legally any Dune, any media outlet, any culture presentations, about canon orthodox and den chat. And on respect human rights o fall and respect flight, gender, language chat from Grossly, Rudley to Kiev.
Series of laws starting from 2017, long before the special military operation became inevitable. Legislation exterminating legally any Russian education, any Russian media outlets, any Russian cultural presence in Ukraine, and recently they prohibited canonic Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And this is all against the demand of the UN Charter in Article 1 to respect human rights of all, irrespective of race, gender, language, or religion. So Article 1 of the Charter is grossly, rudely violated by the Kiev regime. And the West,
You threw common rights and shut up people, OO bridge auto was a septvash.
some biological diversity, they shut up about this particular situation when the regime of their Russian, if you wish, is doing things which violate the key interests of each and every person. People who citizens of Ukraine, all of them are deprived, and all of them, most of them are much more comfortable in Russian than in any other language, and they are deprived of these rights. And when we draw attention of the West to these unacceptable violations, they don't respond at all.
Idursilev and Massa, under the Zelensky defense of Europe and Europe firm racism, firm regating Cal people with faith. Optimism bowed to future.
European values. If European values is racism, which is what is going on regarding the Russian culture and Russian people, then I'm not very optimistic about the future of such a Europe. So
Hope and China firm Brazil initiative chat.
Would be taken into account because it mentions the need to implement the Charter and to be guided by the UN Charter. I discussed it with our friends, and I hope that when they are going
Developer
to
wrote
some
itself,
roadmap,
the principle of chat in from Ukraine is the principle of the territory of integration.
the principles of the UN Charter in their entirety and interrelation, because otherwise it will be the Western position. The West takes from the Charter, when we discuss Ukraine, only one principle: territorial integrity. They forget about
Right people deter, principle respect, right deter league infect, colony rulers represent people boss, independent.
Respect for right for self-determination, which was the legal basis for decolonization. In fact, colonial rulers did not represent the people they ruled. They exploited them and exploited the natural resources of the lands on which these people live. And the people decided that you're not my boss. We want to be independent, and we want to have rulers who would be acceptable to us. Something like this is happening in Ukraine, because the regime
Can represent people's language, Kali Rice and
whose
Extermina
language,
Dekalize,
cultural,
People and Acts,
access to
Donbass,
information,
Novorossiya.
religious
Phila
rights,
Bati mining
they
Oltizen in
exterminated
Zelensky
by
beef,
law.
hurried Ags life fighting and
and,
games lines context. And interview
the
Wait
same,
Korapel about Donbass yes
the
two
same
sides de
attitude,
line context. Zelensky with people and
see,
gentlemen
I think
prime
there
mini
is some
putschist after
similarity
Deku.
between,
Calling people
decolonization
rejected
and
de
what
Sabs publicly
the,
brate legali and
people of
physicalia.
East and West, East and South of Ukraine, Donbass and Novorossiya, what they feel about Kiev regime. They do not accept legality of this regime. And the regime is anti-Russian. Russian meaning also citizens of Ukraine. When Zelensky, before the special operation in 2021, when the Minsk agreements was still alive, but Ukraine was fighting against the line of contact, and when he was asked in an interview by some Western correspondent what he thought about the people of Donbass on the other side of the line of contact, Zelensky said, "You call them people. There are people and there are species." That's what he said. The previous, the gentleman who was once prime minister of this putschist government after the coup, he was calling the people who rejected the coup subhumans, and so on and so forth. And they publicly were bragging that they will eliminate Russians legally and physically. This is the quotation from representative of the
Offices of Zelensky.
So, like in colonial rule,
And the Kiev regime will give a representative Hugh Posh Offball deduction.
huge
Just end, this is a referend of Fedor's speaking aspirations from Brazil for a non-negative slice F and Voint present
citizens of
review.
Ukraine, and who decided at the referenda to come back to the Russian Federation. Yes, and speaking of Chinese-Brazilian initiative, we were slightly surprised when we learned that France and Switzerland were invited to be present as observers. France, as we just discovered, is not discovered, reiterated once
Gain
again,
from the end of Ukraine and games Feder natural long time. Logic promessing you, in his Tolban Brazil French Day review. Of Right United Global Acts.
Switzerland is not neutral for a long time. It is not very, I think, logical and promising that, yes, we were told by our Chinese and Brazilian friends that they would be just observing without the right to speak. But they would be part of the process in any way. So we raise these concerns, and we don't think it is necessary for the purpose of uniting global South to promote the peace in Ukraine.
It's 11 a.m. and the press conference lasts 1 hour due to schedule. So probably we have time only for publication. Please, Brazilian Global.
Good morning, Mr. Minister Lavrov here from.
That's okay.
It's okay. Yeah. I'm from newspaper O Globo here in Brazil, and I would like to ask you: G7 countries press for a tougher statement here in G20 about the war between Russia and Ukraine, and I would like to know Russia's opinion about this statement and the last-minute decision to include the word infrastructure in this statement to be accepted for the countries.
What was the first question? Can you speak louder?
Yes, this is not working. The G7 countries pressed a lot Brazil to make a tougher statement in the G20 about the war between Russia and Ukraine. In the last minute, the word infrastructure were
included, and
they were pleased about that.
Okay.
I would like to know what Russia thinks about this statement and this word
Infrastructure.
And if I may, about this decree that we knew
To Astrigly
today
in
about
favor
nuclear
at the Union
doctrine
Times,
in Russia
Comp United
and in the
States,
world,
President
fear for
Gorbachev
nuclear
and
response
President
from
Reagan,
Russia
joint
after
state
the
Mankli
US
Navavi
decision
Bibi
this
Stat.
weekend and the first attack today?
Well, on the second question, we are strongly in favor of doing everything not to allow nuclear war to happen. It was us who first, during the Soviet Union times, suggested to the United States, and President Gorbachev and President Reagan made a joint statement that nuclear war can never be won and never must be started.
Sim
Same
Statkin,
statement
engineer.
we confirmed in January 2021.
Defam
in the format
5.
of P5.
Ol
All
Fife the I Gein is
confirmed this.
terrified. Kvara
When
sets
the
politit.
Ukrainian
Glue the
war
element of the Priminist
against
United
Russia
King.
by the West started, quite a number of politicians in the West were assuming that there might be a nuclear element in this war. Liz Truss, who was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, when she was asked whether she would be ready to press the
Red button with bonds,
she said,
people
"Yes,
Eni,
this is
and the
Prime
chiefs of the
Minister's
staffs of the
obligation
army
and
to
duty."
Untitled Alliance France, Macron
People
offici
in
repita,
Germany,
or on Moni
Chief of
Ada
Staff
Europi
of the
Politi
German
converse.
army, was quoted as saying that Russia must understand that NATO is a nuclear alliance. In France, Macron and his officials repeatedly were mentioning this. And of course, many other European politicians. We never started this conversation. And the
Update
upgrade
Miles
of the
would no
military
difference
doctrine
confuse from America, Dr.
does not
Dockmans.
add anything,
Plugged in a convention infirm in that
which the
const
West
pret,
wouldn't
Annie
know,
Annie Nuclau.
and does not add anything which would be different, let me put it this way, from the American doctrinal documents on what to do with nuclear weapons. We are convinced that the nuclear weapon is first and foremost a weapon to constrain any, prevent any nuclear war. This is how we
Hyan bit
handle
shocking every
this
at
situation.
Resolution General
And,
Assembly Hiroshi Nagasaki.
the West is
Neva Eva
not less
Resolution Hiroshi Nagasaki.
honest, I would say, and it's really shocking to see that every now and then Japan introduces a resolution to the General Assembly which says that we have to commemorate the victims of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Never ever this resolution mentions who did it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japanese textbooks.
School University itself Nayoti fight defrascal bombing of Hiroshi Nagasaki. Full union enters, yes again. Apollo message dates front line, General Assembly, Security, Atom Energy Actly in Declare Apti Summit. Clit Freak Infrastructure. This generic paragraph in line international human rights law conflict. And hastened mentions from Ansept was civil about civil infrastructure with Declare, small paragraph Velcom with Annie and Nishi. Infrastructure context, condemn destroyal El Sauchel infrastructure inclusive school with hospital. Practice Sauchel infrastructure of gas from Nanzi, and on IPA Sauchel infrastructure. And FOM's civil infrastructure inclusive energy infrastructure, INSI Declare Patakula terrorist ATEC. And gay Nord Stream HP pay lines Kuming Rashanina, and with Declare firm Vanov argument investigate, and trans sofas.
Towards the world free of nuclear weapons. This is our position. As regards the word infrastructure added to the generic paragraph, which calls to be in line with international law, international humanitarian law, human rights law during any conflict. And it especially mentions that it is unacceptable to hurt civilians or civilian infrastructure. This was added. And then the text of this section of the declaration speaks about Palestine, and after that a small paragraph on Ukraine, which welcomes any peaceful initiatives. Infrastructure in this context means that we condemn elimination of social infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, what have you. Practically entire social infrastructure in Gaza is non-existent. And of course, apart from social infrastructure, there are other forms of civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure. And we will insist, using this declaration in particular, that the terrorist attack against Nord Stream gas pipelines coming from Russia to Germany, which were blown up in September 2 years ago, that this declaration is one of the arguments which we will use to ensure that the investigation is transparent. So far, the Germans and other Western countries who
Statue
started
Investigate.
investigation, they don't share
Annie of
any
America
results.
Representative,
And,
Foreign Minister Poland,
many
in public Liplad,
American
United States influ.
representative and the foreign minister of Poland were publicly saying that this is something which the West should applaud because the United States did this to undermine Russia's influence. So this
Infrastructure and
infrastructure
impet.
is also important.
Thank you.
Спасибо.